At the end of the last episode, I asked, when did you last sit in complete silence? No phone, no music, no podcast, just sitting. Usually a lot of people say they can't remember. Or that they tried, and 2 minutes in, they were already holding their phone without even noticing they'd reached for it. That's not a failure of willpower, and it's not distraction. Today I want to talk about why exactly this happens and what's actually hiding behind that almost reflexive urge to drown out the quiet. But first, a small experiment. Right now, put the phone down, turn everything off. Just sit for 30 seconds, do nothing. What did you feel? Calm, boredom, a vague, hard-to-explain anxiety, an immediate urge to turn something on, look at something, give yourself something to do. If it felt uncomfortable, you're not alone. And it's not a coincidence, not a personality quirk. It's a specific mechanism, and that's exactly what we're going to take apart today. Why modern people have lost the ability to sit in silence. What exactly is so frightening in there? And most importantly, what's hiding behind that fear if you have the courage to look? Let's start with a simple observation. Look at your average day. You wake up and the first thing you do is pick up your phone. You're on public transport, headphones in. You're cooking, a podcast or a video is playing. You go for a walk, music. You go to bed, a series or a feed until you fall asleep. Is there a single moment in that day when you just exist? Without content, without stimulation, without someone else's voice in your head. Not meditating, not practicing mindfulness, not completing some exercise, just being with whatever is actually here right now. This isn't a judgment. I've done it too, most people do. But the question worth asking honestly is this a habit or is this an escape? Because there's a vast difference between I enjoy listening to music and I am physically incapable of being in silence. And a lot of us crossed that line a long time ago without noticing. Researchers at the University of Virginia ran a series of experiments that produced one of the most unsettling findings in psychology in recent years. Participants were asked to spend between 6 and 15 minutes alone in a room. No phone, no book, nothing to do. Just sit with their own thoughts. The results were striking. A significant portion of participants described the experience as unpleasant or unbearable. Some of them, mostly men, though women too, chose to give themselves a small electric shock rather than sit in silence. This is not a metaphor. It was a literal choice of physical pain over an encounter with their own mind. What does that tell us about what's in there that's so frightening to meet? It's worth being more precise here, because fear of silence is actually several different things that we tend to collapse into one. The first is thoughts we don't want to think. In the constant stream of information and stimulation, there's no space for them. They exist somewhere on the periphery of consciousness. Anxiety about the future, unresolved questions, decisions that have needed making for a long time. Conversations that have needed having for even longer. While music is playing and a feed is scrolling, they stay quiet. But the moment silence arrives, they move to the foreground immediately. And the brain, trained to avoid discomfort, reaches automatically for any available distraction. The second is emotions we haven't had a chance to process. Unprocessed feelings don't go away, they accumulate. Anger that had nowhere to go. Grief that there was no time for. Anxiety that got buried under work or entertainment. In silence, all of this starts to surface. And if a person isn't used to meeting these states, the sensation feels dangerous. Not because it actually is dangerous, but because it's unfamiliar and unpredictable. The third, and perhaps the deepest, is an encounter with yourself. Not the version of yourself you present to others, not the role you play at work or in your family, but something rawer and more uncomfortable. Questions about who you actually are, what you actually want, whether you're living in the right way, whether you're heading in the right direction. These questions are loudest in silence, which is exactly why silence is so frightening for people who have been living for a long time in the gap between who they are and who they think they should. B. I remember what it was like living in the student dormitory. I talked about this in the last episode. There was almost no solitude there. Always someone nearby, always noise, always someone's presence. And I thought I was managing fine. My productivity was dropping, my mood was all over the place, but I was putting it down to tiredness, to the workload, to anything. Only later did I understand what was actually happening. I had no space to meet my own thoughts and feelings. They were accumulating, and instead of processing them, I simply wasn't registering them. Because there was no silence in which they could be heard. This is important to understand. Avoiding silence isn't laziness, and it isn't weakness. It's a coping mechanism for something that feels unbearable. The only problem is that it works in the short term. In the long term, it creates a debt that eventually comes due. The phone deserves its own conversation because it has taken on a very particular role in our lives that has long since moved beyond being a tool for communication. From a neuropsychological perspective, social media and endless scrolling operate on the same mechanisms as other forms of addiction. Every new post, every notification, every like triggers a small dopamine release, the neurotransmitter associated with the anticipation of reward. The brain learns fast. Want to feel better? Pick up the phone. Want to mute discomfort? Pick up the phone. Don't know what to do with yourself? Pick up the phone. This pattern embeds itself through thousands of small repetitions, until at some point, your hand is reaching for the screen before you've even registered that you're uncomfortable. The problem is that dopamine obtained this way doesn't satisfy. It creates an illusion of fullness and immediately demands the next dose. So the person who picks up the phone, just for 5 minutes, finds themselves 40 minutes later in a state of strange emptiness. Not rested, not informed. Just having spent time and feeling vaguely guilty. Sound familiar? But the most important thing isn't that the phone steals time. It's that the phone steals contact with yourself. Every time you reach for it in a moment of discomfort, you send yourself the same signal. What I'm feeling right now is unbearable. I need to run from it. And that signal, repeated thousands of times, gradually builds a belief. Your own inner world is something dangerous, something dark, something best not encountered. Not because that's true, but because you've never given yourself the chance to find out whether it is. There's one idea I want to say plainly, because it feels central to everything in this topic. A person who doesn't know how to be with themselves cannot truly be with others. That sounds counterintuitive. You'd think that if you're constantly socializing, constantly engaged, constantly in contact with people, you'd be more socially developed, not less. But in practice, the opposite tends to be true. Because the capacity for genuine closeness isn't about filling space with conversation. It's about being present. Listening to another person without thinking about your phone at the same time. Tolerating a pause in conversation without immediately filling it with words, just because silence feels uncomfortable. Being with someone else's pain without fleeing into advice and solutions. A person who is frightened by their own silence is inevitably frightened by silence in relationships. And this directly affects what we talked about in the first episode, the quality of connection. Beyond that, a person who never spends time alone with their thoughts gradually loses access to their own desires, values, and intuition. They start living in reaction mode, responding to other people's requests, to external stimuli, to what's expected and accepted, but they stop hearing themselves. And at some point, they discover that they're not entirely sure who they are or what they want, beyond what's expected of them. This isn't an abstract problem. It's something a lot of people encounter, especially after 30, when life looks settled from the outside, but there's a strange feeling inside that something's off. That you're living a life that doesn't quite feel like yours. And you don't know how to fix it, because you haven't been hearing yourself clearly enough for a long time to know what exactly needs to change. Now I want to flip the perspective, We've talked a lot about why silence is frightening, but what if it's frightening precisely because there's something important in there? Existential psychology holds that anxiety isn't always a signal of danger. Sometimes it's a signal of growth. We feel anxious not because something bad is there, but because something real is there. Questions that need answering, feelings that need acknowledging. Desires that are frightening to discover, because once you find them, you'll have to do something with them. This isn't a threat, it's an invitation. Silence is not emptiness. It's the space in which you can finally hear yourself. And if you avoid that space for long enough, you gradually lose access to yourself. To your intuition, to your actual needs, to the sense of your own life as something conscious and chosen, rather than something that's simply happening to you. I know this from my own experience. When I finally had the chance to work in my own rhythm, without the daily obligation of being immersed in other people's spaces and requests, I started noticing thoughts that seemed to have been absent before. Not because they were new, but because things had finally gone quiet enough for me to hear them. There's nothing mystical about this. It's simply what happens when you stop constantly drowning out the background. Being able to tolerate silence is a skill. Not asceticism, not a spiritual practice for the chosen few, not something that requires special conditions or special preparation. A skill that can be developed, and one that directly affects the quality of your life, in relationships, in work, in your sense of yourself. This isn't an episode with instructions to meditate for 40 minutes a day, and everything will sort itself out. Because if silence produces strong discomfort, forcing it is pointless and even counterproductive. The brain will simply increase its resistance. The starting point is steps that the nervous system doesn't register as a threat. 5 minutes in the morning, no phone, just a cup of coffee and a window. A walk without headphones, not as an exercise, just as a walk. A deliberate pause between tasks, not to practice mindfulness, but just to spend a moment in whatever is actually here. The key principle is this: not to fight the discomfort, but to learn to notice it. When you reach for your phone, pause for a second and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? What am I finding it uncomfortable to sit with right now? This doesn't mean you have to sit with it, but the awareness alone already changes your relationship to that state. You move from automatically avoiding to consciously noticing, and that's already a different position. Over time, silence stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a resource. Not immediately, but it happens for everyone who gives themselves the chance to try. Not because there's nothing heavy in there, but because it turns out the heavy things are bearable, and meeting them releases far more energy than constantly avoiding them does. At the end, the questions. Not to find the right answer, but to look at your own situation more clearly. Writing them down works completely differently from just thinking them through. On the avoidance pattern, think back over the last 2 or 3 days. In which moments did you automatically reach for your phone or turn something on in the background? Try to find not the external trigger, but the internal one. What were you feeling right before? Boredom, anxiety, awkwardness, tiredness from something specific. On what's hiding in the silence. If you knew for certain that your own thoughts were waiting for you in the silence, which ones would you least want to encounter there? This isn't a rhetorical question. The answer is a map of what in your life has long been waiting for attention, sitting somewhere on the periphery. On your relationship with discomfort. When you feel uncomfortable, is your first instinct to remove the discomfort or to understand what it means? Is that a response you choose, or one that just happens? Can you remember a moment when it became a habit? On contact with yourself. Do you have a sense right now that you know what you want, really want, not what you're supposed to want or what's the right thing to want? If not, when did you last feel that? And what changed since then? On the small step, what one specific moment in tomorrow could you spend in silence? No phone, no content, just like that. Not an hour, not half a day. One moment. Write it down right now. Otherwise, tomorrow, there will be 1,000 reasons why it didn't happen. We've looked at why silence frightens us and what's hiding behind that fear. But there's a next level to the same story that we haven't touched yet. Let's say you've learned to be with yourself. You have people in your life. You're not physically alone, and you're working on not running from yourself. And yet, there's still no one you could call at 3 in the morning when things are really bad. Not because there are no people, but because there's not a single one who actually knows you. 500 contacts in your phone, hundreds of followers, and a complete emptiness where genuine closeness should be. Why this happens in the modern world, and what exactly gets in the way of building deep connections, that's the third episode in this series. See you in the next one.